Welcome to Survival of a Nation Lesson 2. As was mentioned a few times during this course, but I'll mention it again now. This course is not immediately, but preceding a trip that a few of us are going to be taking from the Pasadena Jewish community to Israel in March of 2022. If you'd like to join us, please reach out and we'll help you figure that out. Lots of information at landandspirit.org if you'd like to check it out. Registration is fully open, and I believe they want to try to get everybody registered before September 1st. So if you have any interest, please reach out. Like that, we can start that process. There's availability to pay in installments if that's something that you need to do, because the trip is only in March. Very exciting stuff. Today, we are going to be doing Survival of a Nation Lesson 2, which is titled Lightning Strike. And we're going to be talking about the ethics of preemptive strikes. So, as was the case with our previous lessons, or lesson, we will be learning these lessons or kind of anchoring these lessons in different episodes and different positions that Israel was in during the Six-Day War. So last week we spoke about kind of the general attitude preceding the Six-Day War, the Jewish claim to Israel. And now we're going to talk about literally right before the Six-Day War and the beginning of the Six-Day War, which actually began, as many of you I'm sure are familiar with a preemptive strike by Israel. In other words, Israel was the first to strike. And this ended up being a little bit of a contentious issue, because if you're the first to strike, that means, quote unquote, you began the war. The question on the table today is, what gave Israel that moral power? So let's start off by seeing the position that they were in. Let me just make sure the sound is shared, and we're going to do a little video.
In May of 1967, Israel felt an Arab noose slipped around its neck. Egypt, Syria, and Jordan mobilized their modernized armies for synchronized war, with the backing of much of the entire Arab world and the Soviet Union. The Arab states broadcast their intention of fully annihilating Israel's inhabitants. Acting on deliberately false Soviet intelligence that Israel had mobilized to attack Syria, Egypt rolled its forces into the Sinai Peninsula on May 16th. All that kept the Israeli and Egyptian foes apart was a delicate line of blue, the UN's first attempt at armed peacekeeping. But on the same day, Egyptian President Nasser ordered the peacekeepers to abandon Sinai, clearing his path to the Israeli border. Upon receiving Nasser's demand, UN Secretary General U Thant did the unthinkable. He failed to consult the UN Security Council. He failed to ask Egypt to reconsider. He even failed to stall for time in the hope of resolving the crisis. Instead, he ordered his peacekeepers to immediately withdraw from Sinai. Israel's foreign minister, Abba Eban, subsequently complained to the UN. What is the use of a United Nations presence if it is in effect an umbrella which is taken away as soon as it begins to rain? Indeed, the region seemed closer than ever to an apocalyptic downpour. Israel was horrified by the UN's hasty withdrawal, but a contemporary CIA assessment insisted that Nasser was just as shocked that the UN had failed to call his bluff. John Hatton, the CIA chief in Israel in 1967, reported,
"For me, it was just like a little boy who's being held by his father, and the little boy is shouting, 'Let me at him, let me at him.' And he doesn't want to be let at him at all, but all of a sudden the father lets go of him." Nasser was being held by his shirt tails by having this UN front. And when he demanded that it disappeared, and no one was more surprised than he, I think.
On May 23rd, Egypt blockaded the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping in a deliberate attempt to provoke military conflict by effectively laying siege to Israel, which was now cut off from its primary oil supply route and its trade routes with friendly Asian and African states. Such a move was an act of war under international law, and Israel could not afford a prolonged blockade. As the noose began to tighten, Minister Eban described his country as breathing only with a single lung. As the Middle East tottered on the brink of anarchy, a panicked Israel pleaded with foreign countries and agencies to intervene, but was met with deafening indifference. It sent Minister Eben and Mossad chief Meir Amit on frantic missions to America and Europe in search of a diplomatic solution. The UN Security Council refused to take Israel's existential concerns seriously. An Emergency Security Council meeting insisted upon by Canada and Denmark ended with no clear conclusion. Its necessity repeatedly questioned and mocked by participant members. Thought did make a report regarding the withdrawal of UN forces and expressed concern. No actions were taken as a result. France refused to acknowledge any acts of aggression on Nasser's part. Instead, it strongly cautioned Israel not to strike preemptively. Britain offered sympathy for Israel and outrage against Egypt, but no action was forthcoming. And the United States, Israel's most important ally, refused to pledge to defend Israel militarily, even if it were attacked. It then tied Israel's hands by warning sternly that it would not support Israel at all if Israel conducted a preemptive strike, albeit in self-defense. Instead, the United States attempted to rally international support for a peaceful reopening of the Straits of Tiran by sailing an international flotilla through the blockaded canal. But its efforts were met with the same collective reluctance that only 2 decades earlier had silently abetted the murder of 6 million of Europe's Jews. Israel would have to break the noose on its own, despite being vastly outnumbered and facing enemies at every front. But could it? Desperation is the mother of resourcefulness. Israel's military calculated that the side that struck first had the most realistic chance of winning. They reckoned that surprise and air supremacy were the twin keys to the conflict, and developed a bold but risky plan. At precisely 7:14 a.m. on June 5th, almost every Israeli warplane took off, leaving only 12 behind to protect the country. They flew low across the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, slipping beneath Egyptian radar and under the range of anti-aircraft batteries, and arriving precisely while the enemy pilots were busy with breakfast. In wave after wave, following brilliant strategy, they attacked Egypt's numerous airfields across the length and breadth of the country, returning to Israel to refuel and rearm at the unprecedented speed of just 7 minutes. Israel destroyed the colossal Egyptian Air Force of some 300 planes and disabled its runways and air defenses in just 2 hours. Operation Focus, or Mifta Mocha in Hebrew, formally started the 1967 war. But it gave Israel the coveted element of surprise, so that it needed not fight on its enemy's terms. It spared her from the potential loss of her own airfields and from painfully lopsided dogfights in the air. It ripped the carpet from beneath Nasser's feet and prevented him from blitzing Israel's civilians in fulfillment of his apocalyptic pledge to annihilate every last Jew in Israel. Most critically, Israel's preemptive strike enabled its air force to fully support its troops and armored units on the ground, a factor most favorable to the outcome of the war in the furious days that followed.
The rest, pretty much history. Of course, Israel dominated from the air, and this was an amazing beginning to the war. And the rest is history, right? Israel won the war, and miraculously, in just 6 days, not just won the war, but managed to take over more territory, which will be the topic of future classes. But in today's lesson, what I'd like to talk about is the ethics of the fact that Israel struck first. And we'll talk a little bit about what international law has to say about that and what kind of different examples of that throughout history. But we're specifically going to focus, of course, on the Torah's perspective. From a Torah, legal, and moral and ethical perspective, did Israel have the right to strike first? Welcome, Nicholas. and welcome Israel, which I think is
That's Arnold.
Yeah,
Yeah, I missed.
that's okay. That's okay. That's the code to get in, but everybody here knows it. Don't worry about it.
Yeah.
Okay. So we'll get started by obviously laying the firm groundwork. I know most of you are familiar with the fact that Judaism is a religion of peace, is a religion that promotes peace, and at all costs we should be pursuing peace. But let's just see that clearly in the Torah, and then we'll kind of build off of that. Marilyn, you have a question before we start?
I just have a question. I mean, not a question, but I just say this should be very interesting because I didn't read chapter 2 yet, but it seems like I could answer it in one word. You know, you can answer it yes or no.
Right. But and I'm glad you brought that up. Yes, we could answer that in one word, either yes or no, right? Were they morally justified or not? But usually, specifically topics like these that are morally ambiguous, first of all, the yes or no situations are not usually when people come with a question. It's usually when things are a little bit more gray, as we're going to see throughout the lesson. More importantly, it helps to be able to answer the question not in just a yes or no, but a yes and a why, or a no and a why. That's extremely crucial because if you're going to make a decision like that, that's going to cost thousands of lives. You want to be able to make it based on a firm based on firm fundamentals of morality and ethics and value of human life. So that's kind of the goal.
Well,
all right.
Okay, but I think in this case I wouldn't even bother with this chapter because I mean, from the Torah's perspective, I think it's important to have that information, but okay. I don't think there's any
hold on. Why don't you wait till the end of the lesson, and then
okay.
I have a feeling you'll have a different perspective on it by the time.
Okay. Good.
Okay. So let's start with the firm fundamental that Judaism believes, the Torah believes in peace at all costs. Starting with text 1a. Judy, if I can ask you to read for us, please. So we're on page 48.
Greatest peace for the entire Torah was given to engender peace in the world, as it is stated regarding the Torah. Her ways are pleasant ways, and all her paths are peace.
Thank you, Judy. So if you've ever been to a shul and you've watched them lift the Torah in the air, we all sing together. And then we say, her ways are pleasant ways, and all the paths are peace. Right? Now, this does not mean that the Torah doesn't have rules for war and you know, parameters under which war is necessary, but the Torah is a Torah of peace. And as we continue text 1b, Judy. So that was, by the way, from Maimonides, and Maimonides was quoting Proverbs, which is from the Tanakh. Now text 1b is from Ethics of Our Fathers. Judy, continue, please.
Paul would say, be of the disciples of Aaron, a lover of peace, a pursuer of peace, one who loves people and draws them close to Torah.
So what text 1b is adding, thank you, Judy, is that we must not only love peace, but we should actually pursue peace. And we should always seek peace before resorting to any non-peaceful options. Text 2 starts to talk about what's if we get to a situation in which there might not be a peaceful option, or the obligation to search for peace first. Marilyn, can you read for us text 2, please?
War may not be waged against any human being in the world before extending an overture of peace. As it is stated, when you approach a city to fight against it, you shall offer it terms of peace.
Before Jews fight a battle against anyone, we are obligated by the Torah to first offer them the option of peace and kind of provide a way out in order to allow for a peaceful resolution before we wage a war. As with everything in the Torah, this is the origins for this are found in stories of our forefathers. In this instance, we're going to talk about the story of Yaakov. And Heidi, I'll ask you to read text 3a and 3b in just a moment. Yaakov, or Jacob, the third of our forefathers, finds himself about to encounter his brother who wishes to murder him by the name of Esav or Esau, right? The famous twin brothers. And Yaakov now needs to prepare himself for what's going to be, right? What's going to happen. And so he does so in 3 fashions. And we'll read about this in the text in just a moment. But he does so in 3 methods. Number 1 is he sends gifts of diplomacy, in this case, cattle. In those days, that was the, if a man was rich, usually it was based off of cattle. And he sends gifts and multiple entourages of gifts, each one with another message. I seek peace, I want peace with my brother, etc. But at the same time that he's preparing these diplomatic entreaties to Esav, he's also praying to God. He davens. He spends a lot of time in prayer. One of the most moving prayers in the Bible is found in that parsha, in that section of the Torah, when he says, "Hatzileni na miyadach." He starts off and he says, "Katonti mikol chasadim." I've been made small. I feel humbled from all the greatness, the goodness, and the kindness that God has shown me. But I'm asking that you should please save me from the hand of my brother. And then finally, of course, he prepares for war. Okay, so he's got this three-pronged approach for how he's going to deal with this impending potential disaster. But let's take a look at Yaakov's attitude when it comes to this. Heidi, if you can, text 3a from the parsha of Vayishlach in the book of Genesis.
The angels returned to Jacob, saying, "We came to your brother Esau, and he is coming toward you, and 400 men are with him." Jacob was very frightened, and he was distressed. He was frightened lest he be killed. He was distressed that he might be compelled to kill others.
Okay, that was text 3b, and that's Rashi explaining why the Torah tells us Vayira Yaakov me'od vayitzer lo, a double language here. He was frightened and he was distressed. Why was he frightened and distressed? What were the two levels? So Rashi explains that Yaakov was worried that he might be killed, or that some of his party might be killed, and he was worried lest he come to kill others. Now remember, this is in a situation where he would only be killing in self-defense, and yet he was still worried about this. And from here come the fundamentals for the Jewish laws of war. Our desire is not just for peace, because from a selfish perspective, that we desire to live peacefully, but also from the perspective of others, that we don't want to kill anyone else. We want to live at peace with them. And that's why we always ask for peace before anything else. And so to summarize, anytime that we go to war, we have to have that same attitude that Yaakov had. We should be frightened and distressed, frightened to be killed and distressed lest we come to kill others. And this starts to shape the Jewish attitude to war, as we'll see in text 4a, where we're holding here. Arnold, if you can read for us, please, text 4a.
When your camp goes forth against your enemies, be on guard against all forms of impropriety.
So this is a verse in the Torah, the same Torah that just told us all about peace and how we should be peaceful and peaceful and peaceful. The Torah tells us that when, not if, when you go out to war, it's inevitable that at some point you're going to go out to war against your enemies. When you do, says the Torah, be careful. Sometimes in their desire to have precise English translations, they get very sophisticated with their words. You should guard yourself from every bad thing. In the battlefield, you make sure to guard yourself against every bad thing. What is the elaboration here? So for this, we have to turn to the commentary that explain the halachic ramifications here, which is text 4b. Arnold?
In my estimation, the meaning of this commandment is as follows. The Torah admonishes us to be careful at a time when sin is prevalent. The practice of army battalions is well known. When they go to battle, they routinely rob and plunder and engage in illicit and licentious behavior, and all that is despicable within a modicum of shame. The traits of cruelty and fury are aroused in the soldiers, even those who are otherwise decent human beings, when they descend upon the enemy. Therefore, the verse admonishes, be on guard against all forms of impropriety.
Thank you, Arnold. I don't know if we have anybody here on the Zoom that's been in active battle, but even if you just watched a movie about it, even if you just heard about it from others that have been in active duty, you know that war is not a pretty scene, right? And war is not a pretty place. And there's a lot that kind of goes justified because, oh, it's part of the war and all sorts of messes happen during the war, etc. And that's why it's specifically in this situation, the Torah admonishes us and tells us when it comes to war, we have to be extremely, extremely careful about what we do. So to summarize the Jewish attitude to war, it is, number one, beforehand, there should be a reluctance. At all costs, we should try to broker some sort, well, not at all costs, but we should try to broker some sort of peace agreement, whereby we render the need for war unnecessary. Excuse me. And then, when necessary, during the war, we have to make sure to avoid any sort of situation which might be morally ambiguous, and stick to the things that the war that require the war and that the war requires. Okay, so that being said, this all applies to war. Now the question is, what about a preemptive strike? Okay, so a preemptive strike is kind of a very different situation, because obviously there is no war here at play, and the strike is quote unquote being called preemptive because there's a war that's anticipated, at least in the mind of the one doing, administering the preemptive strike. There's a worry, there's a fear, and possibly even some sort of confirmed intelligence of some sort that there's going to be a war, and therefore they'd like to be the first ones to strike. Why? Because that gives them the advantage, it gives them the upper hand, whatever it is, right? Now, the issue with a preemptive strike is always going to be that everyone can blame you. You struck first, right? We all remember when we were kids, if you were in a fight with some other kid or your sibling,
He hit me.
or whoever it was, exactly. Immediately, as soon as the parents or the teachers get involved, it's he hit me first, he hit me first. What if difference he hit you first, right? That's always the parent's immediate reaction. They say, so he hit you first, that means you have to hit him back? Now, obviously in war, yes, if somebody does hit you first, you have to hit them back. Self-defense, that's how it works. And possibly sometimes that's how it works on the playground as well. I don't know. I won't weigh in on that. But where do these ideas come from? Where do these powerful moral stances on preemptive strikes come from? It actually comes, believe it or not, from one of the most famous and notable trials to be held really in history in November of 1945. And October of 1946. I am, of course, referring to the Nuremberg trials, when many prominent members of the leadership of Nazi Germany who planned, carried out, were involved in to some degree or another in the Holocaust and World War II were judged at the Nuremberg trials. So in text 5, we see that although obviously each person was tried for their specific crimes and there were witnesses, etc., but there was also an underlying factor, and it was almost like the one crime that was committed by all of Nazi Germany that in a certain respect outweighed all other atrocities that they may have committed. Nick, do you have a book with you?
I'll pick it up this week, I promise.
Okay, no worries. Whenever you'd like to. It's sitting in my office here. I have a stack of books here.
Thank you.
So, Rochelle, if I can ask you to read for us, please, text 5.
Can you hear me?
We do.
Okay. The charge of in the indictment that the defendants plan and wage aggressive wars are charged of the utmost gravity. War is essentially an evil thing. Its consequences are not confined to the belligerent state alone, but affects the whole world. To initiate a war of aggression, therefore, is not only an international crime, it is the supreme international crime, differing only from other war crimes in that it contains within itself the accumulated evil of the whole.
Thank you, Rochelle.
Okay.
So one of the overarching issues on the table with regards to Nazi Germany was that it was a war of aggression, right? It wasn't a war of self-defense. It wasn't, right? And when someone does administer a preemptive strike, that's obviously the issue on the table. Is this a war of aggression? You started it. You are starting up with your neighbor. You are the one who can be held at fault here because you started a war of aggression. Now, obviously, on page 53, we have the question for discussion because we've kind of hit our two extremes here. Right? We have someone who's literally hard pressed that there's about to be a war, and therefore they have a preemptive strike, which at least in some situations is probably justifiable, right? And then we have at the other end of the extreme, we have, I guess, Nazi Germany, but really any example of someone who's completely committing an act of aggression. There's no self-defense involved here whatsoever, literally just looking to conquer more territory. And the question is, are there circumstances under which initiating a war of aggression would be justified? And if yes, what would those circumstances be? Anybody?
Well, Egypt and the Arab states threatened to annihilate the whole state of Jews and all the Jews in the state.
So you're saying self-defense would be one.
Well, yes, it's with the preemptive strike was self-defense. They didn't really initiate the war in a true sense. Right. It's like the kid who does all sorts of things, teases and, creates hostilities. And well, I guess the other kid wouldn't have to strike back, but he'd have to do something to get relief.
Right, to get the upper hand. And so you're bringing up the very first and foremost time of when a war of aggression, in other words, when someone initiates a war.
But it wasn't a war. The Jews.
Hold on. We're not
a war of aggression.
We're not holding the 6-day war yet, right?
Okay.
So in theory, if there is a strong case for self-defense, then we would say we might to some degree justify a war of aggression. In other words, the closer we are to a situation we are not attacking is the equivalent of being attacked, right? That's when such a war, a preemptive strike, would be justified. This principle was expressed by John F. Kennedy in text 6. Lon, can you read for us, please?
I cannot because I have no texts here.
Oh, okay, no worries.
But I had a comment about this, your previous question, if I may.
Go ahead.
There was no evidence of belligerence on the Israel's part leading up to this preemptive strike. And given all the video, as described in the video, there were multiple cases of Israel trying to go by diplomatic
100%.
before they went.
To gun though. Hold on. We're going to get to the 6-day war. We're discussing an idea right now. Okay, an idea, which is the idea of preemptive strikes. Is that ever justifiable? And we need to understand that there are times when it's totally not justified. We have to understand that sometimes it can be interpreted, it can be disguised, so to speak, as a preemptive strike, but really it's a war of aggression. And we have to understand that that's kind of a spectrum that we have to always be following and appreciate where we are on that spectrum. Is this a war of aggression? Is this an act of aggression? Or is this a preemptive strike? Right? Is this self-defense, or is this just you conquering more territory? Are you Nazi Germany, or are you just trying to live? Right? So, I think we arrived at a very strong point, which is what I'm trying to emphasize here, which is the closer we are to a situation where not attacking is the equivalent, is basically being attacked. That's the more we are, the closer we are to such a situation, the more justified a preemptive strike is, as JFK says in text 6. Judy, if I can ask you to read, please.
Neither the United States of America nor the world community of nations can tolerate deliberate deception and offensive threats on the part of any nation, large or small. We no longer live in a world where only the actual firing of weapons represents a sufficient challenge to a nation's security to constitute maximum peril. The 1930s taught us a clear lesson. Aggressive conduct, if allowed to go unchecked and unchallenged, ultimately leads to war.
Thank you. President Kennedy here is speaking about in the context of the Cuban Missile Crisis. He's referring specifically to the threat of nuclear weapons and the fact that the Soviet Union was involved in that. He had, I guess, Khrushchev, right? That's his name.
Khrushchev,
had agreed. Here we go. We have a Cuban. We have different experts on different topics. Here we have an expert in the Cuban affairs. He had agreed to Castro's request to place nuclear missiles in Cuba. And so Kennedy is talking about this. He's saying you don't need an actual act of aggression in order for that to happen, but there are some times that it's deceptively disguised as self-defense, but really it's offense. Really, and I want to use this kind of as our litmus test. This boils down to one line from the 1800s, actually, believe it or not, from U.S. Secretary of State Daniel Webster. Raise of hands if anybody's familiar with the Caroline Affair. Test you now on your high school history. Yeah. Okay, so the Caroline Affair is during the uprising of northern Canada and the U.S. against their British, the British forces there, and the U.S. kind of chose not to get involved. However, there were, I guess, multiple ships, but one particular ship, which was the Caroline ship, which was sent by personal, I guess, organizations or support or activists in the U.S. who were supporting the Canadians again in their uprising or supporting the British. I forget the exact details. Anyways, they sent a boat called the Caroline up to Canada. It was full of course, arms and possibly even soldiers. No, I think it was mainly arms and supplies, and it was intercepted. They lit the boat on fire, if I recall correctly, and sent it down Niagara Falls. It's quite a scene if you can picture that. Anyways, obviously there was lots of discussion in the wake of this. And Daniel Webster, at the time was the U.S. Secretary of State, and this became kind of the Caroline, they call it now the Caroline test. You can look this up online, the Caroline test, which is kind of the litmus test for when something is considered an act of self-defense and when something is considered an act of aggression. And the line that I want to talk about is that he says the necessity of that self-defense has to be instant, overwhelming, and leaving no choice of means and no moment for deliberation. In such a situation, even if it's a preemptive strike, it's considered self-defense. Okay? So now, obviously, there's a lot of emphasis here that the act has to be anticipatory to something that's happening, and that threat has to be imminent. And obviously, that leaves even that litmus test still leaves us with a little bit of even this Caroline test, so to speak, leaves us with a little bit of leeway, because everybody could say, oh, it was imminent, they were going to attack, etc. And that's where Alan Dershowitz starts to weigh in. So what's if the attack is not 100% certain? They have this great image here, which I'm going to pull up here, which I think really. All right, so here's where we're introduced that the supreme international crime is a war of aggression ever justified, and we spoke about number one, it has to be an imminent attack, and number two, it has to be anticipatory to something that is specifically happening right now, right? So it's always justified to knock over the coffee if it's about to spill on your computer. Okay, so before we start getting to some examples, Alan Dershowitz really summarizes in text 7 we are now, on page 54, how blurry this is and how there really hasn't ever been a very clear line that if you stand on this side of the line, it's self-defense. If you stand on the other side of the line, it's aggression. Heidi, can you read for us, please, text 7?
There is little in the way of an accepted jurisprudence or morality of anticipatory self-defense in the military context. What we see instead are a series of ad hoc decisions made over time and place, some of which have been validated by the verdict of history, others condemned. Not surprisingly, history's judgment seems to depend in large part on whether the action that was taken turned out, in retrospect, to be right, rather than on whether it was justified on the basis of what was reasonably believed at the time it was taken. Since we can never know for certain how a preventative or preemptive military action will turn out, indeed, we do not even have a shared definition of success, these ad hoc verdicts of history provide little in the way of prospective guidance to what sorts of anticipatory military actions are legally or morally justified. At one extreme is the total annihilation of a perceived enemy who has taken no outward steps toward mounting an attack or even preparing for one. Throughout history, nations and tribes have set out to destroy their enemies before they became strong enough to pose a realistic military threat. At the other extreme is waiting to be absolutely certain that the enemy is about to attack and simply beating him to the punch. That was Israel's claim when it preemptively attacked the Egyptian and Syrian air forces at the beginning of the Six-Day War of 1967.
Okay, so it's obviously blurry, but here's the good news. Thank you, Heidi, for reading that for us. We don't have to get the whole world to agree on a standard. I have to get here on this Zoom 8 people to agree, and tonight another 30 people to agree on one consensus. So I have a feeling that the 4 examples that I'm going to bring up now are going to be so clear in retrospect that almost everybody agrees on these ones. But you'll notice right away that the reason we're going to agree on them is going to be because we have the benefit of hindsight, right? So like Dershowitz says, we get this great perspective. We look back and we say, oh, yeah, now 40, 50, 30 years later, most of these are going to be within our lifetimes, maybe not all of them in my lifetime, but certainly everyone here's lifetime. And we're going to be able to look back at them and say, yeah, looking back now that all of the classified documents have become declassified, et cetera, yeah, it looks like it was the right move or the wrong move, and we'll probably have a consensus. Let's go through them one at a time. Number 1 is Osirak. Right, so Osirak was a city in Iraq, and on June 7th in 1981, Israel surprised Iraqi forces with an airstrike that destroyed Osirak, and there was an Iraqi nuclear reactor which was under construction some 10 miles outside of Baghdad, and that was the end of that. Now, Israel, of course, claimed that it acted in self-defense, and I will read for you here just because it's such gorgeous It's just beautiful the way he worded it. I'll read for you here what Menachem Begin said at the time. He was prime minister at the time, and he gave a press conference following the strike, and he articulated what became known as the Begin Doctrine. Okay, it's not in your books, but I have it here. I'll read it for you. He says, "We chose this moment to attack the reactor. Now, not later, because later may be too late, perhaps forever. And if we stood by idly 2, 3 years, at the most 4 years, and Saddam Hussein would have produced his 3, 4, 5 bombs, then this country and this people would have been lost after the Holocaust. Another Holocaust would have happened in the history of the Jewish people. Never again, never again. Tell so your friends, tell anyone you meet. We shall defend our people with all the means at our disposal. We shall not allow any enemy to develop weapons of mass destruction turned against us." Beautifully illustrated, beautifully worded, right? He demonstrates the point that this was an act of self-defense. It was not an act of aggression. We took out a nuclear reactor, and if not, there literally could have been a second Holocaust. The world, however, was not so impressed. The UN Security Council unanimously passed a resolution condemning the Israeli raid. The US condemned Israel and strongly rebuked them for this act of aggression, etc., etc. However, it didn't take too long, a couple tens of years and a little more information, etc. And people realized just how freaky it would have been for Saddam Hussein, for King Hussein, to have had weapons of mass destruction at his disposal. And in fact, in an interview in 2005, Bill Clinton expressed his support for the attack. So 2005 is literally not that much later, right? When did we say it was? 1987? Sorry, 1981. So we're talking 24 years later. Bill Clinton says, everybody talks about what the Israelis did at Osirak in 1981, which I think in retrospect was a really good thing. It kept Saddam from developing nuclear power, yada, 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 yada. Text 8 and text 9 really drive this home. Where are we here? Marilyn, text 8, please.
The most wonderful example of preemption is the modern era. In the modern era was Israel's attack in June of 1981 on the Osirak nuclear plant that would have had nuclear weapons in Iraq's hands by probably 1985, 1986. For my sins, I was at the United Nations when the new Reagan administration went along with the resolution of the Security Council condemning Israel for that. I'm mortified to think back at it. It was a big mistake. I thought it was absolutely right at the time to condemn Israel, but thank God Israel did that. Looking back at it. Really. The idea of Saddam Hussein's being the main Arab leader with nuclear weapons since 1985 is frightful.
Okay, so here you have the US, thank you, Marilyn, who at the time condemned the attack, saying, no, now looking back, I'm embarrassed. He says, for my sins, right? I'm embarrassed that I was even present at the time that the US was involved in condemning the attack, thinking of Saddam Hussein being an Arab leader with nuclear weapons since 1985 is extremely frightful. Now, obviously, 1981 was a preemption to that fact, 4 years prior. But you know what? It really goes much stronger than that. Saddam Hussein himself admitted that it would have been terrible for him to have had, well, not that it would have been terrible, but that was his intention. Arnold, text 9.
Mr. Hussein said he was not surprised that Israel felt threatened by Iraq, which he asserted would defeat Iran and emerged with a military that was stronger than ever. Once Iraq walks out victorious in its war against Iran, there will not be any Israel, he said in 1982 conversation. Technically, they are right in all of their attempts to harm Iraq.
This is the man himself saying it. Okay, so obviously, I don't think you can ever get at least post facto confirmation than actually getting it from the horse's mouth itself. So I think we can safely say that the conclusion is that although the premise was that Iraq would soon acquire nuclear weapons, and the reaction was universal condemnation, but in hindsight, many, if not all, would say that this preemptive attack was justified. On the flip side of the spectrum, we have the 2003 war in Iraq. And I'm going to try not to get political here, even though I know these politics are kind of a little bit behind us. But at the time, we all remember how heated it was. As we know, the whole war in Iraq began because, well, first of all, as we know, the war in hindsight is not viewed favorably. And the reason for that is because the whole war began as a preemptive attack based on the fact that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. And as the story goes, they came, they saw, and there were no weapons of mass destruction, right? Nothing was to be found. President George W. Bush created a commission to investigate the seeming intelligence failure, and that results in text 10. Where are we here? I think Judy, please. Text 10 on page 57.
On the brink of war and in front of the whole world, the United States government asserted that Saddam Hussein had reconstituted his nuclear weapons program, had biological weapons and mobile biological weapon production facilities, and had stockpiled and was producing chemical weapons. All of this was based on the assessments of the US intelligence community, and not one bit of it could be confirmed when the war was over. This failure was in large part the result of analytical shortcomings. Intelligence analysts were too wedded to their assumptions about Saddam's intentions, but it was also a failure on the part of those who collect intelligence. In the end, those agencies collected precious little intelligence for the analysts to analyze, and much of what they did collect was either worthless or misleading. Finally, it was a failure to communicate effectively with policymakers. The intelligence community didn't adequately explain just how little good intelligence it had, or how much its assessments were driven by assumptions and inferences rather than concrete evidence.
Thank you, Judy. So the 2003 war on Iraq, the premise was that Iraq was developing weapons of mass destruction, but in hindsight, there was faulty intelligence. I want to point something out here. You know, it would be easy to bring the example of the Iraq war and say, well, preemptive strikes are not a good thing, right? I think a clear lesson from the Iraq war is not that preemptive strikes are never necessary, but that when we take preemptive strikes, we have to be extremely cautious to make sure that there's no intelligence errors, strategy errors that are being committed, to make sure that our preemptive strike is actually justified. So it's not necessarily a lesson that preemptive strikes are wrong, but that this preemptive strike was wrong because it was based on faulty intelligence. Okay. I think equally, so here you have two examples, one on one end of the spectrum, one on the other end of the spectrum. I think you have, and obviously you'll note that we're avoiding the 6-day war because we're getting to it. I think you have good examples, not only of, meaning there are good examples for and against preemptive strikes, not only in situations where preemptive strikes were taken, and sometimes historically viewed as justified and sometimes historically viewed as unjustified, but also when preemptive strikes were not taken, like the strikes that weren't, right? There are the strikes that were, and then there are the strikes that weren't. And often there's disasters that followed them after a lengthy discussion about whether we should preemptively strike or not. One example is World War II. In World War II with the Nazis, believe it or not, we're going to quote Joseph Goebbels. We're literally going to quote the Nazis in how if at a specific point, that's text 11 here, if at a specific point the United States, the Allies, would have launched a preemptive strike, or if they would have attacked sooner, then the Nazis wouldn't have even tried going further. So here we see that it was clearly mistaken not to attempt a preemptive strike. Heidi, if you can, please, text 11.
No one has stated the result of the Western Allies' hesitancy to confront Hitler better than Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's diabolical propaganda chief. In April 1940, on the eve of the Nazi invasion of Norway, he told a secret briefing. Up to now, we have succeeded in leaving the enemy in the dark concerning Germany's real goals. Just as before 1932, our domestic foes never saw where we were going or that our oath of legality was just a trick. They could have suppressed us. They could have arrested a couple of us in 1925, and that would have been that, the end. No, they let us through the danger zone. That's exactly how it was in foreign policy, too. In 1933, a French premier ought to have said, and if I had been the French premier, I would have said it, the new Reich chancellor is the man who wrote Mein Kampf, which says this and that. This man cannot be tolerated in our vicinity. Either he disappears or we march. But they didn't do it. They left us alone and let us slip through the risky zone, and we were able to sail around all dangerous reefs. And when we were done and well armed, better than they, then they started the war.
So clearly a preemptive strike in that situation, I think, again, if we're hearing it from the horse's mouth, right, a preemptive strike in that situation would have been justified. Again, retrospectively, we can say that in hindsight, looking back. But obviously in the situation, they made the decisions that they did. Another example on the topic of preemptive strikes that did not happen, the Six-Day War is very, very often contrasted against the Yom Kippur War, right? In 1973, the Yom Kippur War resulted in a tremendous amount of more casualties, even though Israel was in a much better position. That these massive buffer zones, remember this was before they gave back the Sinai Peninsula, so they had a massive buffer zone of the Sinai, they had a massive buffer zone of the Golan Heights, and yet still, somehow, the casualties in 1967 were less than 800, and the casualties in the Yom Kippur War were more than 2,500. So what led to the fact that although they had preemptively striked and started the war in 1967, when it came to 1973, they waited for the Arabs to attack them. This article from Haaretz magazine titled Golda Meir's Nightmare shed some amazing light on this topic. I'll read it for you now. It's text 12 in your books on page 59. I will note, by the way, that Golda Meir was so haunted by this idea that elsewhere she writes that she actually considered suicide. I think on the second or the third day of the war, she actually considered suicide because she really felt that the decision she made was so terrible. Anyways, let's see how it's described. Before daybreak on Yom Kippur, October 6, 1973, Golda Meir had a bad night's sleep. She had a premonition that something dreadful was about to happen. At 4 a.m. on that 1973 Yom Kippur, the phone rang in the prime minister's home. Golda Meir's nightmare became a reality. Her military secretary, Brigadier General Yisrael Lior, was on the line. He told her concisely, information has come saying that the Egyptians and Syrians will launch a combined attack on Israel in the afternoon. Before she left her house that Saturday morning, Meir asked her military secretary to convene a meeting with Israel Defense Forces Chief of Staff Dado Elazar and ministers Moshe Dayan, Yigal Alon, and Yisrael Galili. Participants were to gather in her office before 7 a.m., but the meeting was delayed. At about 8 a.m., two matters were brought to Meir's attention by Elazar and Dayan, the defense minister. The men disagreed about the two subjects: the scope of the reservist call-up and whether or not a preemptive strike should be ordered. The issue of whether or not to deliver a preemptive blow was more complicated. Elazar claimed that launching such a strike would save many lives. Dayan counseled that the chance of such a blow succeeding at a time when the army had yet to be called up for deployment was slight. The prime minister refused to go ahead with the preemptive strike. As Meir recalled, Dado, I said, I know all the arguments in favor of a preemptive strike, but I am against it. We don't know, any of us, what the future will hold, but there is always the possibility that we will need help. And if we strike first, we will get nothing from anyone. 3 years later, two young Jewish researchers, Stephen Rosen and Martin Indyk, the future U.S. ambassador to Israel, wrote a study entitled The Temptation of Preemption in the Fifth Arab-Israel War. Their research probed the price paid by Israel as a result of the decision not to go ahead with the preemptive strike. Had Meir authorized such a strike against Syria's missiles and air force, the pair wrote, it could have destroyed 90% of Syria's missile bases within 3 to 6 hours at a price of less than 10 lost Israeli planes. Clearly, this result would have had a decisive impact on Air Force losses later on. And also, and this is still more significant, on the efficiency of tens of thousands of Air Force sorties conducted during the war. Israeli fatalities on the ground would have been reduced, the wearing down of Arab artillery and of tanks and fortified vehicles from Arab armies would have accelerated, and strikes against Egyptian bridges on the Suez Canal would have been more efficient, the study argued. Kenneth Keating, the U.S. ambassador to Israel, arrived at the prime minister's office while the meeting was still in session. Meir adjourned it and briefed Keating about the joint Egyptian-Syrian attack. Later, the ambassador delivered a message from Henry Kissinger, warning Israel's government against taking the first steps to start a war. In her autobiography, Meir wrote that she was at peace with her decision, which she claimed clinched America's airlift to Israel. Indyk and Rosen, however, disputed this interpretation. In their view, had Israel launched a preemptive strike, its action would not have influenced the White House's policy. Military historian Meir Payil was appointed after the Yom Kippur War to serve on a research team formed by the IDF's history department. The team was commissioned to investigate the strategic handling of the war. As Payil sees it, Meir was right not to launch a preemptive strike. In an interview with Haaretz, he said, could the Air Force have acted against Egypt as it had during the war of attrition, at a time when there was a ceasefire, when we had no pretext to act, and against Syria? That morning we didn't know for certain that a war would erupt, nor did the world know about Syria and Egypt's mobilization for war. In order to engage in a preventive strike, you need a pretext, a cause that the outside world can understand. That especially holds true with respect to the US. The world would have accused us of being paranoid. What reason would we have given to explain why we were attacking Syria? That is a fairly comprehensive analysis, without reading a full book on it, of Israel's lack of preemption when it came to the Yom Kippur War. Following the war, the Israeli government established a commission of inquiry to investigate and to see why it was that they didn't preempt the attack. And actually, the conclusion that they came to, and many of you will be familiar with this from one of our recent Wine and Wisdom classes, was about something called the conceptia. In other words, the preconceived notion, or the relaxation, the comfortability that had invaded and influenced all of the military commanders based on their based on their position and victory since the 6-Day War. The Israeli top brass had kind of reached like they had become too comfortable with themselves. And that's kind of what led them to say, we're comfortable enough that we don't need to give a preemptive strike. So now we arrive at the heart of the conversation. When do we strike? We've examined several cases, right? Some that happened and were either are viewed favorably or unfavorably by history. Some that didn't happen, and afterwards, in retrospect, we can say there should have been a preemptive strike. And really, to be honest, with the exception of Nazi Germany, all of these instances have people who justify them and say that if the preemptive strike was negative, that it should have happened, and if there wasn't a preemptive strike, there are people that justify why it didn't happen and why that was the right thing to do, et cetera, even with the hindsight and the retrospective view. So how about the 6-Day War? All right, you guys ready? Here's where things start to get exciting. How about the 6-Day War? The condemnations against Israel at the time were fast and furious. The British foreign officer released a statement which said, on the lines that we now have examined the evidence, we have come to the conclusion that the Israelis fired the first shot, and that's it, and over, finished. France, which until the 6-Day War was the main supplier of Israel's weapons. After the war, France imposed an embargo, an arms embargo, where they no longer supplied Israel with this. The U.S. condemned Israel. And over the years, many have come out against, not necessarily against the war or whatever, but against the fact that Israel started the war with their preemptive strike, accusing it of being illegal, immoral, etc. Based on our litmus test, which we have established, we have to now figure out a couple of things. Number one, at what point is it moral to preemptively strike, specifically in the case of the 6-Day War? And to answer that question, we today, by the way, I should mention that in your appendix, in your book, if you'd like to see an international legal discussion about this, you can see that. But today we're going to focus on the Torah perspective. Number two, we're going to try to figure out what was, in fact, the degree of danger and the likelihood, kind of, so to speak, of an Arab attack on Israel at the time. Okay? Now, I want to just stop for a second to talk, because a lot of you are thinking, okay, this is great. This is such a great moral conversation. But really, Rabbi, what's irrelevant today? The honest truth is that out of a lot of the lessons that we're going to do, and really a lot of the conversations that are about Israel, this is one of the most repetitive. This applies to many things that Israel does today, whether it's just recently, a month and a half ago, when Israel, of course, then there was an escalation, right? So I don't know that it would necessarily have been considered a preemptive strike, but there's no question that some of the moves that Israel did during the targeted bombings and airstrikes that they were doing in Gaza on Hamas, I assume everybody was at least a little bit following what was going on in Israel a month and a half ago, because we were all alive then and all following. So some of the strikes that they did were more preemptive than reactive. Yes, the war might have been reactive and might have been based on an escalation of hostilities. But for instance, the fact that Israel bombed that building, the AP building, AP and Al Jazeera, right, the media building, which had a Hamas headquarters in it, can be viewed to a large degree, even though it was part of a war, and obviously it's a lot more justified. But if you look at that act individually, that can be looked at as a preemptive attack. They're trying to stop future attacks. Similarly with the tunnels, right? The bombing out of the tunnels, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm sure there's so much more that we don't even know about yet because it hasn't come out yet to the international media. So whether it's Hamas in Gaza or whether it's Hezbollah in Lebanon, it doesn't make a difference. Israel faces this all the time, the same decision about whether it is moral and when it is moral to preemptively strike against an enemy. So that's going to kind of be our goal today. Now, I tried to do some research, and I got conflicting reports, but nobody who had a very specific source that they can point to. In other words, I asked a few friends of mine that are very well versed in the Arab-Israeli conflict, and particularly religious folks. To the best of my knowledge, Israel did not consult any rabbis. The Israeli government did not consult, and the military, et cetera, did not consult any rabbis with regards to what the Torah would have to say with regards to preemptively striking at the Six-Day War. I could be wrong about that. Could be there were some rabbis that they consulted. But today, we're going to pretend as if it's being presented to this esteemed panel of rabbis that I have here in front of me on Zoom. And we're trying to figure out from a Torah perspective, based on the position that there is during the Six-Day War, should Israel be striking first? Should there be a preemptive strike? And is it moral? And what is the degree of danger that there is at the moment right now in the position in which Israel finds itself right before this, on the eve of the Six-Day War? Okay, so we begin with text 13. Which is from Maimonides, The Laws of War. Marilyn, if you can read for us, please.
What is considered an obligatory war? A war to defend a Jewish community against an enemy that comes to attack them.
Okay, so it says Maimonides, any war of self-defense, right? It doesn't have to be the whole Jewish people. It can just be a small Jewish community, and there's an enemy coming to attack them. That is considered a war of defense. And the question is, right, especially when it comes to the Six-Day War, do we need to wait until they actually hit us? Or are words, rhetoric, and how certain you need to be about the nefarious intentions of your enemy? So the Talmud elaborates on this. Marilyn, text 14a.
If Gentiles besiege Jewish cities, we do not initiate a military offense against them, nor do we desecrate the Sabbath to prepare a defense. This rule applies if the enemy's goal is solely monetary. If, however, they threaten lives, we initiate a military offense against them, and we desecrate the Sabbath if necessary. If the city abuts the border, even if the enemy does not seek to take any lives, rather they only want to plunder straw and hay, we initiate a military offensive, even if this entails desecrating the Sabbath.
Okay, so Shabbat is a great barometer for how. Remember, we desecrate Shabbat if our lives are in danger, right? So the question is, at what point are our lives in danger? So here we saw a few points, and we'll summarize them in just a moment, but I want to talk about the reasoning behind them. Arnold, if you can, please, text 14b, which is just from the Orders of the World. This is going to be, a lot of our conversation is going to hinge around these words. Go ahead.
14b. Halacha views a city outside the border different for fear that if the enemy conquers it, it will be a launching pad that will allow them to conquer the entire land with greater ease. There is no difference if the enemy has already besieged the city or if they have only declared that their intention to come and plunder the city. As soon as reports arrive that the enemy intends to come and plunder, even though they have not yet arrived, it is permitted to don arms even on Shabbat and be on guard and mobilize the city residents to prevent the enemy from coming. For when lives are potentially at risk, we do not require absolute proof in order to prompt action.
So we have a couple of things here. Thank you, Arnold. We have, number one, depending what type of city it is, a border city or an inner city. We also have whether it is an actual attack or just reports of an attack. And then we also have, and this we had all the way at the beginning of text 14a, which Marilyn read, whether this is just an economic threat or whether this is an actual life and death threat. I have one more text I want to read, and then we'll summarize all these points. Judy, if you can read for us, please, text 14c.
The Gemara Talmud Aruthan 45a sanctions defensive actions on the Sabbath as well as on weekdays against heathens who besiege a border settlement even though the marauding forces seek only straw and hay. Example, they are intent only upon looting or exacting economic concessions. It is clear that in such situations, there exists no imminent danger. It is not at all certain that any life will be endangered. There is, however, reason to fear that even if the aggressor's immediate pecuniary or economic goals are achieved without resistance, having penetrated border defenses, the enemy may engage in warfare at some future time and thereby endanger Jewish lives. The loss of fortified border settlements would leave the entire country exposed and defenseless. Hence, defensive measures are warranted.
So Rabbi Belaich is adding that in addition to the fact that similar to when a fortified city is breached, so that obviously leaves the entire country exposed. Also, if there's an economic breach, if they're attacking for economic reasons and they're successful, that also leaves us, let's call it psychologically exposed, because now the enemy feels emboldened that, oh, they're obviously not so fortified, so we can go and attack them. Okay, these three texts, really four texts, text 13, 14a, b, and c, are going to form the basis of the Torah's perspective for when we must launch a war of defense, when we are obligated to launch a war of defense. Now, the reason we're choosing Shabbat to talk about this is because we have to remember what a special place Shabbat holds in the Jewish conscience. So we don't desecrate Shabbat for anything. I have desecrated Shabbat, at least willingly, only one time in my life. It actually wasn't Shabbat, it was Rosh Hashanah. And as you all know, that was this past Rosh Hashanah when I turned on my phone to order an Uber and climb into an Uber together with my wife to go have Bina. To the Torah, from a Jewish perspective, this is considered, a very high bar to desecrate Shabbat. There are times when we do so. Giving birth is one of them because that poses a danger, right? Something can go wrong. And again, in that situation, when you think about it, there's a lot of parallels because it doesn't necessarily have to be an actual danger, but it can be a potential danger, right? Many women give birth nicely, and not for me, but many women give birth healthily and safely at home. So we're going to the hospital as a precaution, to avoid a potential danger. So now the question is, same question with regards to our risk when it comes to war. At what point do we say it's crossed a certain line, it's time to desecrate Shabbat in order to make sure that we are defended? Okay, so here are the points we've gleaned from texts 14a, b, and c. If it's an interior city, which means it poses no what I'm looking for. It poses no military risk, right? There's no breach in the fortification of the land. And it's only a monetary risk. So then as a result of that, as we said at the beginning of text 14a, we don't go to war. But if there's a human risk, of course, if human lives will potentially be a danger, we do go to war. If it's a border city, it doesn't make a difference what it is. We don't want to embolden the enemy, and we protect ourselves at all costs. Okay, now comes the $1 million question. There were four things primarily that preceded the 6-day war. Okay? Now, I would like to caution you. We are going to do an exercise now. I'm going to ask for everybody's input. But I'd like to caution you against the psychological bias that we all have. I don't know all of you well enough to know what your psychological bias is, but I promise you that within the next 30 seconds, you're going to know what it is. Okay? There are some people that have a very nationalistic attitude when it comes to Israel. They're very I wouldn't say they're like Kahana, but they're very defend Israel at all costs. These people want our annihilation, and that's true. These people are not wrong. The Arabs did want the annihilation of the Jewish people, right? But that's not the question on the table here. The question here is not whether you believe that the military should be strong, peace through strength, and we should defend ourselves at all costs. And even if an Arab so much as looks at me the wrong way, we should murder him and strangle him and torture him to death. Even if that's your personal beliefs, please suspend them for a moment, because we're going to talk about we're trying to gain the Torah's perspective now. The same thing for the people on the other side of the aisle. There are people that by nature are much more pacifist, much more peaceful, and they say no matter what it is, we should always be seeking peace. They related very much with the opening text of today's lesson. The Torah says, seek peace, pursue peace, 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 peace. So even if somebody, what's the line? Like beat them with love. What's the line I'm looking for? fight them with love, or something like that, right? In other words, the person is fighting me, and yet I respond with love, 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 peace, 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 and then eventually, and that there are a lot of values to both sides here. Okay, we're not looking for any of your personal, suppositions or perspectives here. Right now, we're looking for how would you translate the Torah's perspective. I've given you all the texts there are. I mean, there are many more texts afterwards and even beforehand, but I've given you the core texts that form the Torah's perspective, from the Talmud, from the Torah itself, that form the Torah's perspective. So looking at texts 14a, B, and C, we are now going to examine 4 things that happened. Primarily 4 things happened immediately preceded the Six-Day War. In other words, in May and I think in April and May of 1967, which led to Israel needing to make a decision about whether they are going to preemptively strike or not. Our goal is to figure out, based on the Torah perspective, is a preemptive strike justified based on A, B, C, and D? Okay? The first thing we're going to talk about, I think you have this in your books, it's on page 66. The first thing we're going to talk about is the closing of the Straits of Tiran. Okay? Number 2, the removal of the UN peacekeeping force by Egypt, led by Nasser. Number 3, the massing of troops. That was on all borders, right? Egypt, Syria, Lebanon, etc., Jordan. And number 4, the rhetoric and threats. That's always the scary videos that make your heart beat, where you see the Arabs marching through the streets in Syria and in Egypt, etc., chanting death to the Jews, wipe Israel off the sea. You see the graphic images of comics from the newspapers at the time. We're going to push the whole Israel into the sea, etc., right? So these 4 elements that happened, we're going to go through them one at a time, and I will ask for your input. Nick, we're going to start with you, because I like to pick on you. You ready?
Yes.
Number 1, closing the Straits of Tiran. Do you believe that this justified a preemptive strike or not, and why?
It's economic only. It didn't create a risk of physical harm.
So that's why not. Okay?
Correct.
Can you give me a reason why you feel that it would be justified?
Because it was armed. It was done with people with the willingness and the ability to carry out an attack that would take away life. So there was a threat and an armed ability to carry it out.
I will take it back a notch. Hold on a second. You're right, it was done aggressively and it was done where life could be threatened, etc. But what about text 14c? Remember that when it's a border city and we're being passive, in other words, they're only looking for straw and wheat, right? How does that text go? They're looking for straw and hay. It's an economic attack. But when we are weak in the face of an economic attack, we show weakness to our enemies, which is essentially putting Jewish lives in danger. Okay? So I think we've beautiful, thank you, Nick. I think we've gotten to the summary, to the 2 sides of the argument. And you're going to see there's going to be times when you agree more or less on the 2 sides of the argument. At least we're trying to be intellectually sound here and give both sides of the argument. It's justified because there might be later loss of life as a result of showing of this weakness. Remember, this is a massive move that they did, massive economic blow to Israel. And it might be, on the flip side, it might be unjustified because it's economic harm only. Okay. Marilyn, what about the removal of the UN Peace Corps? That's a very generous term there, the removal of the UN Peace Corps. I would call it the kicking out of the UN Peace Corps by the president of Egypt, Nasser. What would you say? Does that action justify or not justify a preemptive attack?
I think it does justify.
Okay, why?
It's a preparation for war on the border. It's evidence that they're going to invade the border.
Why else do you need the blue line gone if not that you intend to cross the blue line?
Yeah.
Right? Okay. But Marilyn, now that we've heard your opinion, now I'm going to challenge you. Tell us why maybe it wouldn't be justified.
It wouldn't have been justified? You mean? Well, they hadn't attacked yet.
Very good. That's a very powerful point. They hadn't attacked it. So it's justified because there's clearly an aggressive intention. You don't take away a peacekeeping force in order to keep peace, right? But it's unjustified because, first of all, they hadn't attacked it. And here's another point, by the way, that they're bringing up here, which we didn't, I don't know that I really agree with this. At the time, Nasser, in his double-tongued speak, gave his reason for why he wants the UN peacekeeping force out. And he said the reason is because if Israel attacks us, which remember the Soviets were providing that excuse by saying that the Israelis intend to attack Syria. So he said, if the Israelis attack Syria, I don't need this blue line here. I want to be able to immediately attack out of self-defense for the Arab nation, because it's important to remember that Egypt and Syria at the time had a defense pact that they had signed previously. So he said, look, I have to defend Syria. That's our pact that we have. That's our agreement that we have. And I don't want that if the Israelis invade Syria, I don't want to have any UN peacekeeping force here. So I'm sending you guys flying because I believe that Israel's about to invade Syria. Okay, so that would have been his flip side. And of course, yes, I didn't invade. I didn't do anything yet. I just prepared just in case I would need to defend myself. I didn't actually do anything. Okay. Number 3, the massing of troops on the borders on all sides of Israel. Heidi, your turn. Actually, you know what? I'm going to give some chances to people who don't have books because they don't really get a chance to chime in. So, Lon, you're up.
Okay.
The massing of troops on all the borders. Does this justify or not justify a preemptive strike?
I think it does justify a preemptive strike, mostly because it emboldens the enemy to be able to overwhelm Israel in the future element of the battle, where they were outnumbered by many, and they would be emboldened. They'd say, we have so many more troops, we're set, and look, and we're going to be able to hone in and destroy. Amazing.
I will add to that one more element. Everybody remember that image that we had earlier of the coffee about to spill on the computer? Remember that U.S. foreign, what was his name? David something from the Caroline affair? I forgot his name. His line was that a preemptive strike is justified when there's two things. First of all, it's anticipatory, right? So you're anticipating something that's immediately coming. And number 2 is when it's imminent. Once there's troops amassed on the border, you can't tell me anymore it's not imminent. There's troops, right, and which I think is what you were saying, Lon. In other words, it's imminent and it's anticipatory. So that's the reason why a preemptive strike would be justified. Okay.
It's anticipatory. We can't prove it was imminent, but it was certainly anticipatory with the mass
they're right.
troops.
They're right there. That's why it's imminent. You're right. I guess we can never prove that. Right. Exactly. So now,
they hadn't started.
Why would it not be justified? Because it hadn't started yet. Okay. Beautiful. Again, I'm starting to agree less and less with the unjustified, right? As we go along, with some of them, it's more or less. But as we'll see in a moment.
I had one other point about the unjustified part of the argument, which is Israel could have further gone and strategized other approaches during the time before the actual preemptive strike happened, and whenever the ultimate
without preemptive
Arab forces started. We don't know. I'm just saying there was more time between when we actually went on the preemptive strike and the ultimate moment, which we don't know because it never happened, when they would have struck. So we could have continued to develop other strategies until the actual attack, including diplomatic, including militarily strategic.
And perhaps a real pacifist might say, you really could have brokered peace during that time, and instead you chose to preemptively strike. Okay, I think that's a little bit putting your head in the sand, but I could see somebody saying that. The last one, which is the hardest, right? The Arabs now begin rhetoric and threats. There's clear sentiment that they're literally going to destroy the Jewish people. What happens here? Heidi, you want to weigh in here? Does this or does this not justify a preemptive strike?
I think on its own it doesn't, but coupled with everything else it does.
Beautiful. That's exactly what I was looking for. In other words, if somebody, if it's like when Menachem threatens me, and he often does. He doesn't want to take a bath, and he tells me, "I'm not going to take a bath. I'm going to go instead to Bubby's house and play." And I'm like, dude, you have nothing to threaten me with. So rhetoric alone possibly is not enough. But when you have rhetoric and threats, so the intentions are clear, backed up by the massing of troops on the borders, plus certain acts of aggression already that they have done, based, economic, etc. So then that justifies it, because now they've declared the intention to attack. But why would even the rhetoric and threats? Why would that not be a reason?
There's another example, like.
Hold on, Marilyn, 1 second. Heidi, you want to finish off for us? What would be a reason that it would not be justified?
What's the question? That was my whole.
Give me the flip side. Why would it not be justified, despite the rhetoric and the threats? Why would it not be justified to preemptively strike?
Because it's not a clear threat. It's not a clear physical threat. It's just words. So there's no There's no threat to economic loss or loss of life by
Right.
just talking.
And I will add to that at the same time that this was going on, Nasser was kind of talking out of two sides of his mouth. So he would kind of claim, he would talk to the crowds and say, we're going to annihilate Israel, we're going to wipe them off the map. And then he would talk to diplomats in meetings, et cetera, and tell them, no, we're not attacking. Don't worry, we're not going to attack. And the question becomes, again, if you're trying to be completely peaceful, completely pacifist, and maybe not worried about your self-defense at all, the question becomes, which one do you believe? In other words, maybe you say he's just talking to the crowds because he doesn't want to become unpopular with the crowds. He's talking to the crowds. And then in the end, he'll give a reason why he didn't attack anybody. He never planned to attack from the beginning, right? You could say that. I think it's a little bit of a stretch. But and here's the point that I want to make. And Heidi began to make that point. In aggregate, all of these together, if somebody would have done only one of them, right? If Egypt or the Arab nation would have done only one of them, that might not have been enough reason to attack. However, all of them collectively give us a very powerful reason why, according to Torah law, which remember that's what we're discussing, it makes sense to attack. Why? Because Israel is defending itself against an imminent danger, against something which it's clearly.
No, sure.
Even though it started economically, clearly, as all of these elements unfolded in that month or two, the intentions became clear. And as we'll see in text 15, a modern day halachist, which means a rabbi who I don't remember if he's still alive. I think he is. I think he's still alive. Rabbi Shlomo Yosef. No, I'm sorry.
78, he died.
Sorry, he passed away in 1978.
Uh-huh.
So right, Rabbi Shlomo Yosef Zevin, most famous for being the editor-in-chief of Encyclopedia Talmudit. If anybody's ever seen it, it's a set of yellow books. We have the library here by us, which basically is an encyclopedia of the Talmud. It's in Hebrew. So he summarizes in text 15. Arnold, if you can read it for us, please.
Let me unmute. Okay. Hypothetically, there are circumstances under which Israel would be forbidden to go to war. In actuality, however, the three wars that Israel has waged, the War of Independence, the Sinai Campaign, and the Six-Day War, and the War of Attrition that followed, were fought to defend Israel's community against an enemy that comes to attack them. This was the situation in all three of the wars, and the same is true today. There are no greater obligations, mitzvah, war than these.
I want to add one more thing to this. Thank you, Arnold. I want to add one more thing to Rabbi Zevin. You know, we often look at these things and we say, oh, but if I had known this, if I had known that, etc. We have to remember that when it comes to these things, just consulting a rabbi is obviously not enough. Just like when it comes to medical procedures, you might consult a rabbi to see what the Torah allows, what the Torah doesn't allow. But of course, you're consulting a doctor because you need to find out the medical facts on the ground in order to make a Torah decision. Similarly here, it's important to understand that based on all of the information that the military experts had at the time, they knew a war was coming, which is why so many people fault them for the Yom Kippur War, right? So based on the military experts, which is the best you're going to get, all of the intelligence that they have and the meetings that they have, etc., and the spies that they had lots of spies, which was part of how they won the war because of Eli Cohen and I forgot the other one who told them exactly when the Air Force commanders were going to be on breakfast break or on the change of shifts, and that's why they were able to avoid all of the defense systems that the Arabs would have had in place. So it's important to understand that it's all of this Torah perspective we're saying, but it's based on the available intelligence that, and of course the fact that the threat was so close because there was no buffer zone. There was no 1967 boundaries. There was no Sinai Peninsula. There was no Golan Heights, etc. So based on this, yes, it would seem that Israel was justified in preemptively striking. How does this apply to today? Modern day threats, right? Whether it's the Iranian nuclear threat, or whether it's Hamas or Hezbollah, how does this apply to this? So in general, when it comes to self-defense, the Torah has one cardinal rule. Judy, can you read it for us, please? Text 16.
The Torah instructs us, if one is coming to kill you, rise up to kill him first.
I want to point something out here. If one is coming to kill you, rise up to kill him first. This is a very powerful statement, and I want to focus on the word to. Haba lehargecha, hashkem lehorgo. not hashkem v'hargo, not rise up and kill him first, rise up to kill him first. There's a very strong difference in that attitude. The Rebbe once pointed out a fascinating idea. The Torah doesn't command us that we must kill people. The Torah tells us we have to rise up to kill them. If they are coming to kill us, we have to rise up to kill them. Very, very often when we rise up to kill other people with an attitude of, I'm willing to defend myself at all costs, that defense becomes unnecessary. This law, by the way, is also applies according to Torah law. If someone comes into your house, an armed robber, and comes into your house with the clear intention that he wants to kill you, you're allowed to get up with a gun towards him and go shoot him. And if necessary, you actually shoot him. But look at the attitude again. Rise up to kill him first. Very often when we rise up to kill, the necessity to actually kill doesn't even become an eventuality, because the person is scared off and runs off, as is the case very often with Israel. And this is where the line peace through strength comes from, that when we show ourselves strong and willing to defend ourselves at all costs in situations where we're being attacked, so then our enemies don't even try, or they back down. And I think we can apply this, I'll leave it to each of you on your own, to many of the modern threats that Israel faces today. But I want to leave you with one more note. In the remaining 5 minutes that we have, and we're doing great on time this week, which is a great makeup for last week. So, a little pat on the back for me here. I want to conclude and leave you with one more point. This is all fine and dandy for us to sit in our living rooms on Zoom and discuss what Israel should or shouldn't have done, what's moral, what's not moral, etc. But I want to remind you that this actually applies, as many of you are probably familiar, to each and every one of us inside of us. You see, each and every single one of us has a battle waging inside of our hearts. The battle between our selfish side, what the Alter Rebbe in Tanya calls the selfish soul, right? The animalistic soul, and our godly soul. And that battle is constantly waging. And sometimes the best thing that we can do is to preemptively strike. Okay? Now, what is the battlefield? It turns out that one of the strongest battlefields is actually prayer. Heidi, if you can read for us, please, text 17 from the Holy Zohar.
All right. Close my book preemptively.
A preemptive closing of the book.
Right, okay, here we go. Sorry. Zohar states, the time of prayer is the time of battle. In every generation and every day, we must wage an internal spiritual battle. For this opposite, this did God create. Within every one of us, there's a holy soul from which emanates holy deeds, words, thoughts, emotions, and perceptions, and an unholy soul. Both these souls strive for dominance, and it is up to the individual to empower the holy soul to defeat its opponent. This battle is waged during the daily prayers.
It starts during the daily prayers, and then it's waged, of course, throughout the day. So what would a preemptive strike be? Of course, we're constantly waging a battle, right? We want to be serving God. We want to be listening to our godly soul, doing right and courageous and moral things, and making the correct decisions throughout our lives, and not listening to our base and animalistic desires or our selfish soul. I want to share with you something, and then I think you'll get the point immediately of what it means to make a preemptive strike when we're talking spiritually about within our own lives. I know that you all know that I grew up Hasidic, which means that I had a quote unquote arranged marriage. I don't know how much you know about that, and I'm not going to get too much into it now, but suffice to say that it's kind of arranged. It's somewhat arranged, but then afterwards, Kitty and I dated for 10 times before getting married. But there was a clear objective while we were dating that we were going to get married, etc. This is how it works in the Chabad circle. Another element of it, which you might not be familiar with, is that before we do get married, right? So once we're engaged and before we get married, one of the things that we occupy ourselves with is study. In other words, there's certain classes about how to be married. Okay. Now, some of it is halachic. In other words, the mikveh and how to go to the mikveh and what the process is when it comes to intimacy in terms of Torah law. But some of it is actually very philosophical or theoretical about the grounds for a marriage. And one of the books that we study about that, the purpose of it is to talk about the sanctity of a union between two people and how neither of them should be breaking that trust, and whether it's sleeping with other people or having outside relationships, all that sort of thing. However, we read a chapter from a book which is called Reshit Chachma. It's a Kabbalistic work. And the chapter, of course, talks about sexual immorality. Fair enough. You're getting married. You should learn about that, right? You should be well aware of the temptations that there's going to be. Great. But we don't start from there. We start with the chapter before. You know what the chapter before is about? The chapter before is about gluttony. Literally, eating too much, enjoying your food too much, being too materialistic, just being about enjoying good food and that kind of thing. Okay? And the Rebbe encouraged that for anyone, and some people take this in classes, some people learn this privately, one-on-one, whatever it is. And the Rebbe encouraged people that if you're going to learn the chapter on sexual immorality, you should also preface by learning the chapter about gluttony. Why is it? Because the Rebbe would point out that it actually doesn't start with sexual immorality. It never starts with sexual immorality. It starts with a self-involvement and living a life of self-pleasure. Why am I here in this world? To have as much pleasure as I can. That starts with food. Now, nobody's saying you're not allowed to have some pleasure from food. Nobody's saying you're not allowed to go out to eat and have a good steak. But creating a lifestyle out of it where everything is about my enjoyment leads you that your sexual life also becomes that it's all about my enjoyment. And we should recognize that it's not about that. There's a holy sanctity to the union. There's a holiness to the union here and a sanctity to the marriage that's way beyond just I feel pleasure or my wife feels pleasure. And when we start with recognizing that on a very simple turf, then we don't even allow it to escalate. In general, it works that way with everything that the evil inclination or the selfish soul tries to impose on us throughout our lives. Judy, if I can ask you please to read for us text 18, which will be the concluding text.
The Yetzer evil inclination finds its opening by enticing a person to engage in permitted pleasures. One who guards that opening need not fear being enticed to do the forbidden. For this is the modus operandi, the wicked counsel giver. First, he advises a person to engage in non-forbidden pleasures. After he has habituated a person to filling his heart's desires in permitted areas and has caused him to crave pleasures and be attentive to his hunger for gratification, he induces him to commit a minor transgression. The temptation for major discretions soon follows. Be careful, therefore, not to overly indulge in permitted pleasures. If you rein in your temptations and minimize your permitted indulgences, you are assured that the Yetzer will not be able to entice you to do the forbidden.
Thank you, Judy. This is why we say the time of prayer is a time of battle. In general, our battle in life is to be more spiritual and less materialistic. It happens at every single moment. And advises us Chassidus, hold on a second. Don't wait until you're locked in the battle and you're trying to figure out, do I give it to my temptation, which is going to wreck my life, but at the same time, no, don't wait for those moments. Start with a preemptive strike. Start by saying, oh, you want me to be self-involved? No, I'm stopping it right here. Even though the Torah fully allows you to be a little bit self-involved, no problem. Or you want me to enjoy life, you want me to enjoy the material world and enjoy it is fine. The Torah allows us to enjoy it. But what we do is we say, even there, I temper it. I'm preemptively striking like that. You shouldn't even be able to warp me in and lure me in with these small temptations, which will eventually lead to greater temptations. And with this, I'd like to conclude, and we'll play the summary key points. So please turn your attentions to the video screen.
Lesson 2, Lightning Strike. 1. The USSR provided Egypt with false information about an impending Israeli invasion of Syria. In response, Egypt mobilized for war, expelled the UN peacekeepers from the Sinai, and blocked Israel's access to the Straits of Tiran. Arab armies massed at Israel's borders, and the Arab world pronounced its intention to annihilate Israel. 2. Israel made extensive diplomatic efforts to avert war, and, when they failed, Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egypt, destroying its air force and commencing the Six-Day War. 3. To initiate a war of aggression, it is not only an international crime, it is the supreme international crime. Nevertheless, it is almost universally accepted that a preemptive strike is justified in an instance when not attacking and instead absorbing the first blow poses a mortal danger. 4. The Torah commands us to seek peace before resorting to unpeaceful options. Nevertheless, according to Torah law, we must preempt the enemy and strike first if we have the information of the enemy's intention to attack. 5. The Six-Day War is often contrasted to the 1973 Yom Kippur War that cost more than 2,500 Israeli lives, when Israel chose not to strike first. During the Six-Day War, however, Israel did not have a buffer zone to absorb the enemy attack. 6. With regard to today's threats to Israel, from the Torah's perspective, once all reasonable avenues for peace are exhausted, Israel should preemptively eliminate any threat, provided the military assesses that the attack will be successful and effective. 7. Non-military experts often lack sufficient information or knowledge to determine Israel's correct course of action. Next week, during the Six-Day War, Israel captured Western Wall, all of which holds utmost historical, cultural, and spiritual import to the Jewish nation. Next week, we will discuss the history and significance of Jerusalem and its holiest sites.
Please join us next week for Lesson 3 of Survival of a Nation, where East met West, the chosen city of Jerusalem. Thank you all for joining us.